we are very delighted this morning to have Dr. Haifa Batarse from the Department of Physical and Occupational Therapy at the Hashemite University to present this interesting webinar, Occupational Science. This is her passion, and I know that you will also be very happy with this webinar. This webinar is part of the series of a lot of webinars we are starting in the last 2 days and today, co-hosted by Just CRS, which is a co-funded project by the Erasmus Plus program of the of the European Union. And this is courtesy of Maharat platform, which is a new free platform offered by Jordan University of Science and Technology. Please come also to the remaining webinars today. And also please enroll in Maharat, because Maharat, you will have free courses in the coming days. So please welcome with me Dr. Haifa Batarse. If you have questions, please write it in the chat room, and we will go over it at the end of the presentation. So enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed Nazal, for this introduction. Today, my presentation is going to be about occupational science and how does it impact occupational therapy practice. The topics I'm going to go over through this presentation are going to be a history of occupational science, introduction of the topic, key constructs of occupational science, the principles of occupational science and assumption of it, research, application to an individual, application to population. Then I'm going to provide an activity, critique, strength of occupational science and weaknesses of occupational science. We're going to over some future development of occupational science, then questions. As I have told you before, I'm going to start with the history. I'm going to talk about the major turnings of occupational science and occupational therapy, and how does it help to establish occupational science as a discipline. The first turning was in early 1900s. In March 15, 1917, occupational therapy was formally established, and the National Society for the Promotion of Occupational Therapy was established as well. So it starts with the early 19 by establishing the occupational therapy and the philosophical and assumptions of occupational therapy. The second turning of occupational therapy and occupational science was in 1920s, where an comprised an optimal base of knowledge was established, and the National Society for Promotion of OT, the name of it was changed into American Occupational Therapy Association. Between 1920s and 1960s, their OT, occupational therapy practitioners, have dropped participation in meaningful occupations from their therapeutic programs. Therefore, some therapists maintained use of activities such as sanding boards solely as a mean of exercise, and they were never used in woodworking projects. So they dropped the idea of meaningful occupations. They dropped the idea of purposeful activities, and they start to focus on the part that needs to have an intervention for. And they dropped the idea of treating the person as a whole, the unity of body, mind, and spirit. So at this time, the focus was on the impairment, and they neglect the underlying occupational therapy principles. Machinistic paradigm had diverted the field from its original mission, which I have mentioned it before, the unity of body, mind, spirit. That's why the third turning came into a view which was happened in 1960s by reevaluate and a new generation of in focusing on occupation and the importance of occupations for human being. In 1960s, between 1960s and 1970s, Mary Riley and others began to call for a return to the most important elements of the field of occupational therapy from the first paradigm. Therefore, the focus has changed into occupation, motivation for behavior, organizations of occupation in time, habits, routines, roles, importance of environment and context. The last turning of this history was in late 1980s and late 1990s, where occupational science was founded. Then still occupational science is still being defined by till today. As I have mentioned before, Mary Riley began to stress the importance of occupation in 1960s. OT models that incorporate occupation were developed. For example, MOHO, the model of human occupation by Gary Kilhofner. Elizabeth Yergza began advocating for the development of basic science that generate new scientific knowledge to support and the applied science of occupational therapy. Therefore, who started or established occupational science as it today? Elizabeth Yergza. It is a basic science, generate the application of science, for example, application through occupational therapy. Occupational science was established as academic discipline in 1989 by a faculty and graduate student and at University of Southern California, led by Elizabeth Yergza. So the formal date for the establishment of occupational science is 1989. The first PhD program was directed by Florence Clark. What does occupational therapy mean? Occupational science mean? Occupational science is the study of human as occupational beings. We used to say human being, but now based on the perspectives of occupational science, we can call human or individuals, persons as a human being, including the need for and the capacity to engage in and orchestrate daily occupation and environment over the life span. In other words, it's a discipline or study of occupation by calling a human being occupational being and studying the need to engage in occupations, the capacity of the people or individuals to engage or participate in occupation, whether their environment and context over their lifespan. Occupations change depend on the lifespan or developmental age where people are. What is the focus of occupational science? Occupational science studies a human as occupational being and the relationship between health, well-being, and occupation. The focus of occupational science to see the magic touch or the connection or the relationship between how does occupation impact the health in positive way and how does occupation affect the well-being of human beings. Research, meaning, purpose, and the interaction between individual and what they do have been studied at the focus of occupational science. Okay, occupational science is an interdisciplinary perspective on the complexities of a human occupation and its contribution to health and well-being of individuals, communities, and societies. Now I'm going to give you some examples of some questions that can be answered by occupational science. For example, occupational scientists conduct research to determine how time use, disabilities, roles, play, and work impact occupation. Another question that can be answered by occupational science: what makes activity meaningful? What are the health benefits of occupation? How do individuals experience meaning? What happens to individuals when they have to change their occupations? Another question that can be answered: the effect of, from what we go through, the effect of a quarantine in the well-being of a human being, change of routine between children and adolescents, and for example, or change the routine and habits between adulthood and old age people. All these questions can be answered by occupational science or occupational scientists. Also, another questions: what are the meaning, what are the cultural impact on the meaning and nature of occupation? How social factors such as class and gender impact occupational pursuits? How do neurobiological process and structure impact human engagement? How do various types of engagement change the neurobiological process and structures? To understand occupational science thoroughly, we have to go over and discuss key constructs of occupational science. Key constructs of occupational science consist of the following constructs: first, occupation; second, meaningful occupation; third, transformative potential; fourth, the model of human subsystems that influence occupation; fifth, contextual influences; then occupational behaviors; and finally, occupational justice. And we're going to discuss all parts of it, which they are described as occupational alienation, occupational deprivation, occupational marginalization, occupational imbalance, and occupational apartheid. Starting with defining and explaining occupations as a construct for occupational science. Occupations are defined as chunk of daily activities that can be named in a lexicon of culture. What people do and they have a name, we can call it as occupation. For example, gardening, skiing, meditation, caregiving, self-hygiene, all these occupations that have a name in each culture, we can call it as an occupation. Occupations have to be meaningful. And in order for occupations to be meaningful, they have to be chosen and performed with reference to the socio-cultural context to generate experience of personal meaning for individuals, groups, or communities. So when we can say occupations are meaningful, if the people themselves choose and perform it with reference, with perspective, with taking into consideration the socio-cultural context of that occupation to generate an experience for a personal meaning of the people. Another construct of occupational science is a transformative potential construct. The meaning of occupation possesses powerful transformative potential, especially I have mentioned this before, occupations have a powerful or magic effect on health and well-being. Aspect of engagement in occupations that promote meaningful and sustained change. This contrast is the USC, University of Southern California model of human subsystems that influence occupation as a construct. Occupational science based in the USC model of subsystem consists of several dimensions. First, it's organized based on the philosophy of general system theory, which consists of subsystems. The first subsystem is the USC model of a human subsystem that influence occupation, was created to depict human subsystems and to use as a framework to organize information. The subsystems of the USC model are the transcendental subsystem, the symbolic evaluative subsystem, the sociocultural subsystem, the information processing subsystem, the biological subsystem, and finally, the physical subsystem. Now I'm going to discuss each one of these subsystems. The transcendental subsystem is associated with the meaning attributed by the person of his or her life experience. So it is the meaning derived from engaging in occupations, or the personal meaning of attributed for this person. The symbolic evaluative subsystem addresses the social system used in personal assessment of value of an occupation. Social systems refer to orderly arrangement and inner relationship of parts. Social system is the pattern network of relationship consisting of a coherent whole that exists between individual groups, institutions, etc. So a person may belong to system include, for example, in nuclear family, your extended family. A person may belong to community, to cities, to volunteer organization, or persons may belong to a Zoom group like what we do right now. The sociocultural subsystem focuses on individuals' perception of culture and social expectations for occupational therapy. So it is stress the cultural, people are embedded in their culture. People are embedded in their social systems and in their social life. So we can't take off people out of their culture. That's why it's important to take the cultural aspect into consideration and social expectations of people. The information processing system focuses on the cognitive processes. So it has to do something with the structure, organization of occupational behaviors that's based on cognitive abilities of human beings, such as memory, learning, planning, attention, concentration, orientation, and etc. of the cognitive processes. The biological subsystem, it encompasses living systems that directly relate to biological adaptation, the will to achieve competency and sensory integration for exploratory and purposive behavior based on the biology of the human being, or the biological composite of a human being or persons. The physical subsystem includes chemical and physical processes need to maintain other level of human system. We know how so many of the neurotransmitter or the chemicals of the body work, and to maintain a homeostasis and to keep the body functioning well. So all the following are the US model or subsystems of the US model of a human, which was designed by University of Southern California. Contextual influences construct. We have three contexts based as constructs for occupational science: the socio-cultural context, historical context, environmental challenge. Sociocultural context are where people with whom the person come in contact with, all people, and we are as occupational therapists, physical therapists, rehabilitation team members, we are part of the social context of our clients. So we should take into consideration all people that a client or a person come in contact with. Also values, beliefs, customs, activity patterns, expectations, and the standards of behaviors is very important aspects or key aspects of the socio-cultural context. As you may know, values, belief, customs, it drive our action and people's actions and engagement in occupation completely based on part of these aspects. Historical context, past values, experiences, beliefs, expertise, and knowledge of the process and the outcome of occupation. So past experience in respect to the human being, him or herself, can derive the process and the outcome of occupations. Environmental challenges, physical, cultural, psychological, symbolic, spiritual, and social challenges may be considered part of the environmental challenge of a human being. Another construct of occupational science is occupational behavior. Three aspects of occupational behaviors are going to be discussed, which they are skills, habits, rules. Skills, the ability to carry out an activity in an appropriate series of steps. Then a step plus a step plus a step equals an activity, and they have to be carried in appropriate series and appropriate order in order to be skillful in performing this skill or activity. Habits, routines, and automatic behaviors done without thought. For example, when you come from work or from school and you put your key where it belongs to without thinking, without realizing you have done these activities. And we have so many habits based on your life roles and your what you do in life. Rules, a rule as a definition is a statement that tells people what they should do in order to be successful or to get benefit. So rules symbolize how the world operates. How do we have to operate? Rules guide behaviors with people, motions, and objects. Another occupational science construct is occupational justice. Occupational justice concerned with two main themes. The first one is the conceptual recognition of occupational nature of a human being. And I have talked about this before. We can call human being, individuals, or people as occupational being. And the importance for them to engage and to participate in their daily occupations or of occupations of choice. The second main theme of occupational justice is respect for and equitable provision for resources to meet the differing occupational needs of individuals and populations as part of fair, enabling, and empowering society. Therefore, all people are entitled to engage in their occupations, and participating in occupation has to be fair, enabling people, and empower society to affect their health and well-being in general. There are 5 themes of occupational injustice: occupational alienation, occupational deprivation, occupational marginalization, occupational imbalance, and occupational apartheid. Occupational alienation represents prolonged isolation, disconnectedness, sense of meaningfulness. So it represents prolonged isolation, disconnect from your roots, living without meaning of life, and emptiness, loneliness, resulting from lack of resources and opportunities to experience enrichment in occupation. For example, the refugees, when they leave their country, their roots, their life, their occupation, their homes, everything, and they become refugees in another country, in another situation, or in a camp. Occupational deprivation. It describes a state in which people are precluded from opportunities to engage in occupations due to factors outside of their control. For example, prisoners, they precluded from many opportunities to engage in occupations. Occupational marginalization occurs when the decision-making process is taken from people attempting to participate in occupations. For example, and I want to highlight, one of the philosophy of occupational therapy, or the main key factors in providing intervention for occupational therapy, is a child-centered and family-centered approach, where the child and the person and the family themselves are active participants in the service, and they have to have the power to make decisions about their life. The fourth injustice, occupational injustice, is occupational imbalance, a configuration of activities within person's lifestyle that does not meet the physiological, psychological, or social needs in manner that is healthful and satisfactory to individual. I think part of what we are going through COVID-19 pandemic, there is part of occupational imbalance, where so many people in the quarantine are cannot do what they used to do in the past. So this is a configuration. Like, for example, the social needs of so many people are not met. The psychological needs of so many people are not met because of the quarantine. Occupational apartheid occur when a certain population or are denied access to participation in occupation due to environmental aspects, such as social aspects, political aspects, or economical aspects. It jeopardizes their ability to engage in occupations. Now, principles of occupational science. Principles is the interrelationship, or the relationship between two concepts or two or more concepts. The individual is illustrated as an open system interacting with his or her environment through his lifespan. So individuals are open systems. They affect in their environment, and their environment can affect a human being. Input from the social and historical context and environmental challenges affect the internal human subsystems, of course, because it is an open system. The sociocultural and historical context, it can affect the internal part of human subsystems. Occupational behaviors is the output of component of the system, the occupational behavior, the skills, the habits, the rules of a human being. It is the output component of the system, which in turn offer feedback to the internal subsystems that are once again mediated by environmental challenge, historical context, and socio-cultural factors. Then the output, like for habits, routines, skills, are component of the system, which the historical context, the environmental challenge can provide feedback so people can change their behavior, occupational behaviors based on this feedback. Assumptions of occupational science. Engagement in meaningful occupations is essential to health and well-being. The recursive relationship between occupation and narratives shape personal identity. Tell me what you do, I will tell you who you are based on your occupational engagement. Another assumption of occupational science is occupation should be examined within individuals' past and intermediate environment. As I have mentioned before, the past, the people's past shape their present and current future to some extent. Occupation is generated by individual who will to achieve the efficacy and competency. Another assumption of occupational science is occupation cannot be completely understood without taking into account what occupation means to the person. It is a cornerstone assumption to understand or to realize or to acknowledge the meaningful of engaging in occupation to that person. The study of occupation requires the integration of knowledge from social biological sciences. To understand occupations, what do we mean by occupations? These are some characteristics of occupations. Occupations are units of action with identifiable start and end. Any occupation in life has to have a start point and an end point. Let's think of any occupation in life. It has a beginning and it has an end. Occupations are repeatable, intentional, and consciously executed. Occupation can be repeated, but based on the occupation itself. For example, there are occupations that have to be repeated so many times. There are some occupations they can be repeated once a week, once a month, once a year. So it depends on the occupation and how meaningful to the, and how is it meaningful to the person. Intention of the person to execute, and consciously chosen and executed. Occupations tend to be meaningful within the context of a person's life. Occupations are intermediate in terms of scope. They comprise unit of doing that fall somewhere between micro behavior and the global life concern. So occupations can be minor and can be big micro behaviors. For example, a meditation can be an occupation. If it is intentional and consciously executed, it can be considered as an occupation. This is something maybe minor. Whereas you can have an occupation where it's in a very large level or scale, also it can be called also occupation. As I have mentioned before, occupations have to have a label or name in the lexicon of a culture or in that community. There is a form and function and meaning of each occupation. Occupational science focuses on the form, function, and meaning of human occupations. Form of function refers to the aspect of occupation that are clearly observable. So things or aspect of any behavior that a human being can observe, we call that a form of occupation. The function of occupation refers to the ways occupation influences development, adaptation, health, and the quality of life. So what is the purpose of that occupation? A meaning of occupation refers to subjective subjective experience of engagement in occupation. So the subjective experience and the gains from engaging in this occupation called meaning, and this is something personal and subjective. There is an example of an occupation and the form of it, function of it, meaning of it, which is cooking Jordanian food versus Western style food. For example, grapes leaves in specific. The form of this occupation, اللي هي wrapping a grape's leaf, which you may all know, اللي هي prepare the mixture of meat with rice with all spices, then put rice and meat in each grape leaf, then roll or fold until you make lots of them, and empty the zucchini and put This is the grape leaves. This is the form of it, or the observable aspect of this occupation. The function of occupation, cooperation between family members, because usually it's cooked for big feasts or big celebrations. It can be leisure time for the family member to gather and to work and to have shared meaning in that. Big meal for the extended family. These can be considered the function of rolling grape leaves as an occupation. The subjective experience of this occupation, it has a cultural and social and personal meaning for so many people, or the people who engage in this occupation. So now I have discussed some aspects of occupational science, but now it's important to mention and realize the interlink between occupational science and occupational therapy. If you look to the left, it says occupational science, and then occupational therapy, and in the bottom are other disciplines. Occupational science, synthesis and analysis of interdisciplinary knowledge in occupations aimed to producing new theoretical insight. What does occupational science aims? It aims to produce new theoretical insight. Basic science studies on nature of occupation and the relationship of engaging in occupation to health and well-being outcomes. Applied science studies of effectiveness and cost effectiveness of occupation based on intervention. Whereas occupational therapy translate into application in clinical community and global context. So occupational science is a science aimed to a new theoretical insight, whereas occupational therapy, the implication and application of intervention become in the occupational therapy, happens in occupational therapy. Expand the scope of practice and justify new jurisdictional claims such as prevention of chronic diseases and disability. So occupational science drives the scope of intervention for occupational therapy. The last one is provide outcome data to third-party payer and to public policy areas. So as you see, all the arrows going from occupational science into occupational therapy, whereas occupational therapy can inform occupational scientists about a problem identification. So occupational scientists start to synthesize, analyze, produce a new theoretical insight, or studies the nature of blah, 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 the importance of occupation to health. What is the relation of other discipline to occupational science? It's both ways. Occupational science contribute to the universe, to knowledge, enriches other academic disciplines and profession, whereas other disciplines may provide occupational scientists or occupational science with knowledge in occupation. So in another word, if I want to summarize this figure, occupational therapy is a profession dedicated to assisting individuals and their families to engage and participate in daily activities, work, leisure, ADL, education. So it is the application of occupational therapy with all the pertinent people for the OT process. Whereas occupational science is the study of a human participation in occupation. Therefore, occupational science is particularly important knowledge source for occupational therapy practice, education, and research. Blueprint for Translation Occupational Science Research Program. It has 7 steps. It starts with problem identification. For example, can activity or occupation-based intervention slow down the decline of normally associated with aging? This is a problem. So first, the problem was identified. The second step is develop theoretical understanding of problem, where identification of intervention needs, domain of outcomes, for example, mobility maintenance, personal safety, decline in the aging process, it has to be understood thoroughly. The third step, develop intervention, for example, a lifestyle redesign. This is a very well-known intervention. Step 4, test intervention outcome, for example, RCTs, randomized control trial, on a short-term basis and on a long-term basis. Step number 5, evaluate cost effectiveness. And one of the purpose of to study the cost and effect of any, like for example, if engage in occupations can decline the aging process and the disorders associating with aging, so it's better to let people engage in their occupation and minimize all the associated problems for old people. Study theoretical model for why outcomes are produced, basic qualitative or quantitative research. Intervention lead to a healthy activity, which lead to increased health and well-being. Step 7, theory development. It goes in 2 ways, in theoretically informed intervention or improve it for like for example, this theory inform occupational therapy of this problem, and the theory developed based on this problem that was identified, or new knowledge in occupation and health can be emerged. Some research based on occupational science, Ludwig 1998. A qualitative research design was used to explore how routines change in later adulthood for 7 Caucasian college-educated middle-class women who were not employed and who were free of major functional impairment. This is one of the questions I have mentioned before, and the results indicated that the participants currently use routine to facilitate their physical and mental health and well-being, but do so to a lesser extent than when they had children living at home or when they worked. Another research is Magnus 2001, explore how everyday occupations change after disease or accident, and how this change in occupation influence identity. 10 women facing disabilities as adults were interviewed. This is a qualitative research. Involvement in meaningful occupations tend to influence the way the women viewed themselves and brought about redefinitions of the meaning of disability. Clark et al. 1997 in her study, she evaluated the efficacy and effectiveness of a preventative occupational therapy intervention specifically tailored for multi-ethnic independent living older adults. Significant benefits for occupational therapy preventative treatment group were found across various health, function, and quality of life aspects. The control groups tended to decline over the study interval. The results suggest that preventative health program based on occupational therapy may mitigate against the health risk of older adults. I think this is the last study, Case Smith, 2000. This study examined how performance component and variable in intervention influenced fine and functional outcomes in preschool children. The influence of play on therapy outcomes suggests that focus on occupation of play. And as we know, a play is the primary occupation for children. Isn't that focus on the occupation of play in intervention activities can enhance fine and visual motor performance. Suggest occupation-based intervention altered component skills of the people. Now, hope you had a clear idea about occupational science. Now I'm gonna show you a video, but please keep these questions on mind while you're watching the video. Please, the video, it's gonna start with an introduction of occupational therapy. Then I think at minute 3 minutes, 37 seconds, the case study will start. The questions I want you to think about: what kind of occupation can Rose engage in? Provide one occupation for each of these areas of occupations: work, leisure, and ADL, and analyze each of their function, form, and meaning of occupation. What occupational therapy intervention would you provide? So they're gonna click the link from their end and watch the video. Hope you have had a chance to watch the video, but I'm gonna summarize the major points or problems or difficulties in the video for Rose. Rose has lost her husband of a tragic accident. She lost her vision. She is dealing with hip problems and arthritis. She is severely depressed to the point she cannot function in a day-to-day basis or to do normal activities. So what do you think can be done for Rose? Provide an occupation for the following areas or for the limitation she has. What occupational therapy intervention would you provide? So the answers of this question, for example, to provide her with aids and adaptation, to check and perform a home visit, do the regularly safely routines at home for her hip, or energy conservation and joint protection and ergonomics factors for a treatment intervention for her arthritis and hip problems. And the answer will be at the end of the video. So now, occupational therapy can be applicable to be used with populations. My questions based of the application of the concepts of occupational science to population would be: what do you think that people in quarantine due to COVID-19 pandemic cannot function fully in their daily life? Why do you think people are complaining? Why do you think people want to go out and do all aspects of engage in their life in they what have used to engage in? Based upon your understanding of occupational science, what occupational therapy would offer for people in quarantine? I have a video from, I think, WHO talks about this. Keep thinking of these highlights or issues, and I'm gonna share my video with you. Listen, the major points I want to highlight,
Yes,
they
please.
are written on the screen itself. So just one. Okay, great. The intention of this, I have an activity for you all now. The intention of this activity was to divide the class or the group into three groups. The first group has to be totally against occupational science as a discipline. The second group has to be totally for occupational science as a discipline. The third group has to be totally neutral, objective about the advantages and disadvantages of the occupational discipline. Because of the structure of the Zoom course, I would like you to take the role of the three groups or the three persons. I want you to be totally against occupational science, totally with occupational science, and totally objective, and think of advantages and disadvantages of occupational science, which leads us to literature critique, which leads us to the strength and weaknesses of occupational science as a discipline. So occupational, this strength points were taken from the literature review. Occupational science is a global movement, a new field as an emerging basic science capable of supporting the practice of occupational therapy. Occupational scientists have much to offer the international community concerned with health and disability. Both occupational therapy and occupational science have an explicit concern with occupation. They share the most common factor between occupational science and occupational therapy both focus on occupation and how is it meaningful to the persons. Applicable to individuals of different cultures, different age groups, different roles, whatever. Develop a new approaches for therapy and improve current science, inclusive of many disciplines. Whereas the weakness of occupational science, as it was taken from the literature, does not have a clear methodology how occupations relate to biological, physiological, and subjective matters of health and well-being across life span. This is my own personal critique of the strengths and weaknesses of occupational science. For me, as a strength, it is a client-centered approach. Take into consideration the life experiences, the meaningful of the activities, culture, history, the subsystems of the human being, him or herself. So this is a strength point to occupational science for me. All of construct fit within the occupational therapy practice framework for occupational therapy. It is an occupation-based discipline, provide support for what occupational therapists do and in practice, applicable to all disabilities, age group, and practice areas. However, the strength point, as I have seen it for the occupational science, it's broad, multi-dimensional. Therefore, it's difficult to use, and sometimes it's difficult to be understood. Complex area of study, still an emerging discipline, where other professionals are unaware of the importance of occupations. As I have mentioned before, there is an interrelation between occupational therapy and occupational science. The application of occupational therapy into occupational science, into occupational therapy based on allowing OT practitioners to become more science-driven and evidence-based. Occupational therapy practitioners are likely to change the way they approach their work because of the knowledge they gain regarding occupation from occupational scientists. Occupational scientists create, test, and refine theory. Occupational therapists use the theoretical knowledge generated by occupational science to create and improve frame of reference and to create new and more efficient interventions. Future development for occupational science, because it's vague and multidimensional, if a methodology to elucidate how occupation relate to biological, physiological, and subjective matters of health and well-being across time, it can be considered as a future development of this discipline. Develop the occupational science in Jordan through introducing it to Bachelor of Science student in rehabilitation teams or other another specialization like PT, speech and language pathology, or the related rehabilitation teams. These are the references, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Haifa.
You're welcome.
There are some questions from the beginning. What is the difference between habits and routines? Can you give us an example?
Of course. Habits and routines. Routine are sets of habits, whereas habits is sets of behavior. Habit, it can be considered something you do in a regular and repeated orders, and it happens regularly. Hope I have answered the question. So routine is a set of habits. Habits plus habit equal the human being's routine.
Okay. May I ask how would you differentiate between occupational therapy, occupational science, and occupational health?
Okay, occupational therapy, it's the art and science of provide intervention based on meaningful activities for people to empower them with strategies to have the optimal level of independence to engage and participate in their daily occupations. Whereas occupational science, it is concerned with studying a human being as a human occupations and the effect of engaging in occupations for the health and well-being. It generates science, theories, and knowledge that can be used to drive the occupational therapy practice. Whereas I think occupational health, it is, I think, a branch of medical field. It deals with health, safety, and welfare of our people.
I think that's it. If anybody has questions, you may ask in the chat area. Otherwise, I would like to thank you, Dr. Haifa Batarse, for this interesting presentation. You have definitely a passion towards occupational therapy, and thank you for that. Again, I would like to invite attendees to enroll in Maharat and watch remaining webinars today and the electronic courses that we are building right now, and it will appear on the platform in the coming days. So thank you so much for attending, and God bless you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nazal, and thank you for Maharat and Just University for arranging this presentation, and thank you for all the work you do for the rehabilitation team, occupational, physical, and other rehabilitation team members in Jordan. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you.